The first hint that my evening wouldn't be as ordinary as I'd hoped came while I was sweeping the back room of our family's spice shop. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden-orange glow that painted the narrow streets outside. Inside, the air was thick with the warm, familiar aroma of cinnamon and cloves, mingling with the faint, salty breeze drifting in from the nearby sea. It was my favourite moment of the day, a sliver of peace after hours spent helping customers and carefully weighing out spice blends. And then I heard it, a single creak from the floorboards behind me. I froze, my fingers tightening around the broom handle. At this hour the shop was usually empty. Maybe it was my little brother playing a prank, or Mom checking on my progress. But when I turned, the figure standing in the doorway was neither of them. It was Ren. Ren had lived next door for as long as I could remember, yet he'd always been more of an enigma than a neighbour. He leaned against the doorframe with the ease of someone who knew they didn't need an invitation to stay. The last rays of sunlight glinted off his dark, unruly hair, and his sharp, piercing eyes zeroed in on something in my hands. My breath hitched as I glanced down, my stomach twisting into a knot. I was holding an old wooden box. It was small, unassuming, but etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the fading light. I'd stumbled across it while cleaning behind the counter, a relic I hadn't seen in years and wished I could forget. I fumbled to hide it behind my back, but it was too late. "What's that?" Ren asked, his voice calm, though curiosity curled around the edges, making my heart race. "It's nothing," I blurted, the words spilling out too fast, too clumsy. Heat rushed to my cheeks as I tried to keep my expression neutral, but his gaze was relentless, pinning me in place. Ren wasn't supposed to be here, not now, not ever. He was the type to spend his evenings fixing boats at the harbour or trading laughs with his friends. But tonight he was in my shop, watching me like he'd just stumbled upon a mystery worth solving. Without a word, he stepped closer, his boots making almost no sound on the wooden floor. "You're a terrible liar," he said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "I'm not lying," I shot back, clutching the box tighter as if I could shield its secrets from him. "And even if I were, it's none of your business." A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, a crooked, knowing smile that made my pulse quicken. "You're holding on to it like it's your diary or something embarrassing." The pounding of my heart grew louder, drowning out the sounds of the street outside. I hated how unshaken he seemed, standing there with the kind of confidence that made him impossible to ignore. "I don't have time for this," I muttered, turning back to my broom and pretending to sweep. Ren didn't budge. "You're running from something," he said softly. His voice had changed, lower now, almost tender, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. "Why do you care?" I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. For a moment he didn't respond, then he took another step closer, his words quieter but no less certain. "Because I've seen that look before, like you're carrying something you don't want anyone else to see, like it's too much for one person." The broom slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor. I turned to face him, the box still clutched tightly to my chest. "Ren, you don't understand. This isn't something you can just fix." His expression softened, the smirk fading as his sharp blue eyes searched mine. "I'm not trying to fix it," he said, "but you don't have to keep carrying it alone." For the first time, I saw something different in his gaze. Not pity, not amusement, just quiet sincerity. And somehow that was even harder to face. The scent of cinnamon and cloves still lingered in the air, but the calm it usually brought me was quickly slipping away. My fingers gripped the old wooden box tighter, its carved patterns pressing into my palms as if reminding me of its presence, of what it held. I wished in that moment that I could disappear into the walls of the spice shop, that Ren's gaze would turn elsewhere. but his eyes stayed locked on me, sharp and unwavering, like he was unravelling a puzzle only he could see. Ren had always been a mystery to me. He wasn't the loud, attention-seeking type like most of the boys in the neighbourhood. He was the opposite, quiet, observant, someone who seemed to blend into the background until the moment he decided not to. That was the Ren who stood before me now, leaning casually against the doorway of my family's spice shop, but with a focus that felt anything but casual. The setting sun caught the edges of his unruly dark hair, giving him an almost golden outline, as though the world itself was drawing attention to him. "What's that?" he asked, his voice steady, calm, too calm. The question hung in the air, between us, heavy and unavoidable. It wasn't just curiosity in his tone, it was something deeper, something that made my chest tighten. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat like the first sting of pepper. My heart beat faster, a wild rhythm I couldn't control. "It's nothing," I said quickly, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt flimsy, brittle, like dried leaves crumbling underfoot. I tried to sound nonchalant, but I wasn't fooling anyone, least of all Ren. His eyes flicked from my face to the box I was so desperately trying to hide behind me. He didn't move from the doorway, but his presence filled the room, making it feel smaller, like there wasn't enough space to breathe. "You're not a very good liar," he said, his lips curving into a faint smirk. That smirk, it was infuriating. It wasn't mocking, not exactly, but it carried a quiet confidence that made me feel exposed, as though he could see right through me. I hated it. And yet, part of me couldn't look away. "I'm not lying," I shot back, my voice sharper now, tinged with a defensive edge. "And even if I were, it's none of your business." His smirk deepened, and I hated the way it made my cheeks burn. "You're acting like I just caught you with something forbidden," he said, tilting his head slightly, his tone light, but his words cutting through my defences. I clenched my jaw, the box still pressed to my chest like a shield. It was forbidden, in a way, not in the sense of laws or rules, but in the way some memories are, hidden for a reason, buried because digging them up feels like unearthing ghosts. "It's just an old box," I said, forcing a shrug. My fingers tightened around it involuntarily, betraying my attempt at nonchalance. Ren took a step forward, his boots barely making a sound against the wooden floor. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, but each one felt like a challenge, like he was daring me to tell him the truth. "If it's just a box," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle, "then why are you holding onto it like it's the most important thing in the world?" I opened my mouth to respond, to throw out another excuse, but no words came. His question struck too close to the truth. The box was important. It held pieces of a story I wasn't ready to share, pieces that still haunted me in the quiet moments when I thought I could finally forget. "Ren," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep it steady, "just drop it, okay? It's not something you need to worry about." His expression shifted, the teasing smirk fading as his brows drew together slightly. Concern flickered in his eyes, softening the sharpness that had been there before. "I'm not trying to pry," he said, and for the first time his voice held a sincerity that made my breath catch. "But you don't look okay." The words hit me like a wave, pulling me under before I could even think to swim. I wasn't okay, not really. I'd spent so much time pretending, pushing down the weight of everything I carried, that I'd almost convinced myself I could handle it alone. But now, under Ren's steady gaze, it felt like all my carefully constructed walls were crumbling. I turned away, my back to him, and stared down at the floor, at the broom I'd abandoned moments ago. "Why do you even care?" I muttered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my pounding heart. For a moment he didn't answer, and the silence felt heavier than any words he could have spoken. Then softly he said, "Because I've seen that look before." I glanced over my shoulder, my brows furrowing in confusion. "What look?" He hesitated, and for the first time I saw a flicker of vulnerability in his expression. "Like you're carrying something too heavy," he said finally, "like it's eating at you from the inside." His words sank into me deeper than I wanted to admit. How could he see it so clearly when I'd worked so hard to hide it? I turned back to him fully, my grip on the box loosening just slightly. "You don't know what you're talking about," I said, though the conviction in my voice was fading. Ren's gaze didn't waver. He took another step closer, closing the distance between us until I could see the faint freckles scattered across his nose, the way his sharp blue eyes softened as he looked at me. "Maybe I don't," he said, "but I know what it's like to feel alone, to think you have to handle everything yourself." His words stirred something in me, a mix of anger and sadness, and something I couldn't quite name. "This isn't your problem, Ren," I said, though my voice lacked the bite I intended. "Maybe not," he said, "but it doesn't mean I'm going to walk away." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken words and emotions neither of us seemed ready to face. But in Ren's eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected, an openness, a quiet understanding that made my chest tighten. "You don't have to tell me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But whatever this is, you don't have to deal with it alone." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, I felt a crack in the armor I'd worked so hard to build. Ren's words lingered in the air, weaving themselves into the silence of the spice shop. "You don't have to deal with it alone." Simple words, yet they carried a weight that pressed against my chest. For a moment I felt something shift, something fragile, like the first crack in a frozen lake. But then reality crashed in, and I tightened my grip on the wooden box as if it could anchor me. I turned away from him, the ache in my chest sharp and unfamiliar. "I don't need your help," I said, my voice steady but hollow. The words felt rehearsed, like a line I'd told myself too many times to believe anymore. Ren didn't move, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze burning into my back. "You keep saying that," he said quietly, his voice softer now but no less piercing. "But I'm not sure even you believe it." I froze, my fingers tightening around the edge of the box. His words hit too close to home, like he was peeling away layers I'd spent years building. I hated how easily he could read me, how effortlessly he saw through the mask I'd perfected. "Why are you still here?" I asked, turning to face him again. My voice was sharper this time, almost pleading. "You're usually off fixing boats or hanging out with your friends. Why does this matter to you?" Ren tilted his head slightly, studying me with those sharp blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Because you matter," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The words stopped me in my tracks. For a moment I didn't know how to respond. My mind raced, searching for something to say, some way to deflect the weight of his statement, but nothing came. I could only stare at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "You don't know what you're talking about," I said finally, though my voice wavered, betraying the conviction I was trying to project. "You don't know what's in this box or why it matters." "You're right," he said, stepping closer, his boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. "I don't know, but I can see how much it's hurting you, and that's enough." His words cut through me, and I hated how much they resonated. I'd spent so long pretending I was fine, convincing myself I didn't need anyone. But now, standing in front of Ren, it felt like all my defenses were crumbling. "It's not that simple," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You think you can just walk in here and fix everything, but you can't. This isn't something you can fix." Ren stopped a few feet away from me, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Maybe not," he said, his voice calm but steady. "But that doesn't mean I'm going to walk away." His words hung between us, heavy with meaning. I wanted to believe him, to let myself trust that someone could help carry the weight I'd been holding onto for so long. But the thought terrified me. Letting someone in meant opening old wounds, facing memories I'd buried deep. I turned away again, my hands trembling as I set the box down on the counter. The intricate carvings on its surface seemed to mock me, a reminder of everything I was trying to forget. "You don't understand," I said, my voice shaking. "This box, it's not just a box, it's..." My voice caught, and I couldn't bring myself to finish the sentence. The words felt too heavy, too raw. Ren took another step closer, his presence steady and grounding. "Then help me understand," he said gently. "Whatever it is, I'm here." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "You say that now, but you don't know what you're asking for. You don't know what's in here." "And you're right," he admitted, his honesty catching me off guard. "I don't. But I know what it's like to carry something that feels too big to handle. I know what it's like to push people away because you think you're protecting them, or protecting yourself." His words struck a chord I hadn't expected. I turned to face him again, my chest tightening as I met his gaze. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just quiet understanding. It was almost worse than pity because it made me feel seen in a way I wasn't ready for. "Ren, this isn't your fight," I said, my voice barely audible. "I don't want you to get involved." "Too late," he said with a small, rueful smile. "I'm already involved." I shook my head, my emotions swirling like a storm I couldn't control. "You don't get it," I said, my voice breaking. "This box, it's a reminder of everything I've lost, everything I've tried to move on from. And now it's here, and you're here, and I don't know what to do." For a moment, Ren didn't respond. He just stood there, his expression softening as he watched me. "You don't have to know," he said finally. "Sometimes it's enough to just let someone stand with you, to let someone help you carry it." His words unraveled something deep inside me, something I'd been holding onto for so long I didn't know how to let it go. My hands trembled as I looked down at the box, the carved patterns blurring as tears welled in my eyes. "I'm scared," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I'm scared of what's in here, of what it means." Ren stepped closer, his voice gentle but unwavering. "Then let's face it together," he said. "You don't have to do it alone." His words broke through the last of my defenses, and before I could stop myself I felt a tear slip down my cheek. I quickly wiped it away, but Ren didn't look away or pretend not to notice. He just stood there, steady and patient, waiting for me to decide. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel: hope. Maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to carry this burden alone. Maybe I could let someone in. I took a deep breath, my fingers brushing over the surface of the box. The carvings felt cool and familiar under my touch, a reminder of the past I was finally ready to confront. "Okay," I said softly, my voice shaking but resolute. "I'll show you, but you have to promise me you won't look at me differently." Ren's gaze softened, and he nodded. "I promise." As I opened the box, the room seemed to grow quieter, the air heavier with anticipation. Whatever was inside, it was no longer just my burden to bear, and for the first time, I felt like I might be able to take the first step forward. The hinges of the box creaked softly as I lifted the lid, the sound splitting the silence of the spice shop like a whisper of a long-forgotten memory. My breath caught as the contents came into view. Inside lay a collection of items that seemed mundane at first glance: a faded photograph, a small silver locket, a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. Yet, to me, they were pieces of a puzzle I'd spent years trying to forget. Fragments of a story I'd buried so deeply it felt like a betrayal to unearth them. Ren stood beside me, close enough that I could feel his presence, though he didn't say a word. His silence was steady, not demanding or impatient, and it made me feel both comforted and exposed. I wasn't used to someone waiting for me like this, giving me space while still offering support. It was disarming. My fingers hovered over the photograph, trembling slightly as I picked it up. It was worn, the edges frayed and soft from years of being handled. The image showed a group of people, smiling, carefree, frozen in a moment of happiness. I stared at it, my chest tightening. The faces in the photograph were painfully familiar, and yet it felt like looking at strangers. A younger version of me stood at the centre, flanked by two figures I hadn't seen in years. Ren leaned slightly closer, his voice low and careful. "Who are they?" he asked, his tone free of judgment or prying, as if he knew how fragile this moment was. I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. "My parents," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "And me. This was before." Ren didn't push for more, but his silence felt like an invitation to continue. I swallowed hard, my thumb brushing over the face of the woman in the photo, her laugh frozen in time, her eyes sparkling with joy I could no longer remember. "They died when I was 10, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "It was a car accident. We were coming back from a trip, and then suddenly they were gone." The room seemed to hold its breath, the weight of my confession settling in the air. I hadn't said those words aloud in years. Even to myself, I rarely acknowledged them. They were too sharp, too final, like shards of glass I couldn't touch without bleeding. Ren's voice broke the silence, soft and steady. "I'm so sorry," he said, and the sincerity in his tone made my chest ache. I nodded, my fingers tightening around the photograph. After that, everything changed. I moved in with my aunt and uncle, started working here in the spice shop. It's where I've been ever since. I thought if I just kept busy I could forget, but I trailed off, staring down at the box. Some things don't stay buried. Ren didn't say anything, but his presence was grounding, a steady reminder that I wasn't alone in this moment. I reached for the silver locket next, holding it carefully in my palm. It was simple but elegant, engraved with a delicate floral pattern. The clasp was slightly tarnished, but when I opened it, the picture inside was as vivid as the day it was taken, a tiny portrait of my parents on their wedding day. "They gave this to me on my 10th birthday," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It was the last gift they ever gave me." Ren's gaze softened and he stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him beside me. "They must have loved you a lot," he said gently. "They did," I whispered, my voice breaking, "and I loved them, but it's hard to hold on to that when all you remember is the way it ended." Tears blurred my vision, and I blinked them away, embarrassed by the sudden rush of emotion. But Ren didn't flinch or look away. Instead, he reached out, hesitating for a moment before resting a hand lightly on my shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it felt like an anchor grounding me in the storm of my memories. "You don't have to keep this all to yourself," he said quietly. "You've been carrying it alone for so long. Maybe it's time to let someone else help." I shook my head, my voice trembling. "It's not that simple. Letting someone in, it makes everything feel real again. And if it's real, then I have to face it. All of it." Ren's grip on my shoulder tightened slightly, his touch steady and reassuring. "Maybe facing it is the only way to stop it from holding you back," he said. "I know it's not easy, but you're stronger than you think." His words felt like a lifeline, and for the first time I allowed myself to believe he might be right. Maybe I didn't have to keep running from the pain, from the memories. Maybe I could start to let go. I reached for the last item in the box, the folded piece of paper. My hands shook as I unfolded it, revealing a handwritten letter. The ink was faded, the edges of the paper worn, but the words were still legible. My mother's handwriting. I read the opening line, and my breath hitched. "My dearest, this is for you, in case I'm not there to tell you in person." The rest of the letter blurred as tears filled my eyes, and I clutched the paper to my chest. The pain was sharp, but beneath it was something else, something warm like sunlight breaking through clouds. It was love, pure, unwavering love, preserved in her words. Ren stepped closer, his voice gentle. "What does it say?" I shook my head, unable to speak, but instead of pressing, he simply stood beside me, his presence a quiet comfort. I turned to him, my vision blurry with tears, and for the first time I allowed myself to let go. He gently took my hand and began kissing me. After a moment, his hand moved to my chest, and I felt something, though I wasn't sure what it was. Suddenly I sensed something hard, and pain started to radiate through me. Then he lowered his face between my legs. What happened after that, I couldn't quite comprehend. "It says she loved me," I said, my voice breaking, "and that she believed in me, that no matter what happened, I'd find my way." Ren's expression softened, and he nodded. "She was right," he said simply. "You will." The words settled deep in my chest, and for the first time in years, I felt something I thought I'd lost, a flicker of hope. The weight of the past hadn't disappeared, but it felt lighter somehow, as if sharing it had lessened its hold on me. I looked at Ren, his steady gaze meeting mine, and I realized he was right. I didn't have to face this alone, and maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to be afraid of the past anymore. Together we could face whatever came next. And for the first time, I felt ready to try.